Action Hour, I'm speaking with Allison Warner, a wetland ecologist and Camino Island resident who has spent her career working in ecological restoration. Allison is recently retired after 16 years as a wetland ecologist for the Tulalip tribes, but continues to contract with Quilceda Village. Allison has been involved in restoration in the Pacific Northwest since 1992, where upon graduating from the UC Berkeley College of Forestry and Natural Resources, she worked 6 years as a soil scientist for the U.S. Forest Service at the Skykomish Ranger District. Thanks for being with us, Allison.
Thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here.
I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. For those listening at home, I've asked Allison to talk with us about wetlands because I think about them a lot. We have a lot of them in Island County. They're not all mapped. Not everyone knows what a wetland is, how to identify one, or why they're important. And so I'm hoping that we can really get into what they are, why they're important, and how we can better protect them. And so I'd love to start off with a very basic question for those who don't know. What is a wetland?
Well, thanks, Amanda, and thanks for taking on this important topic. It seems to be something people are very perplexed about. Wetlands provide so many beneficial functions for our environment. They provide food, breeding, nesting, rearing habitat. They recharge and discharge groundwater, contribute to stream flow, stabilize stream banks. They store storm and flood waters, and reduce flooding and erosion, improve water quality through biofiltration. And, they transform nutrients and toxic chemicals. But many people think of wetlands as a swamp or a boggy area, but there are actually many different kinds of wetlands. Sometimes you can't tell when you're walking in the summer in an area that could be a wetland, because some are just saturated. They have saturated soils, so they have vegetation that's not as clearly indicating it to the most people's eye. Wetlands can be forested or open herbaceous or grass-like vegetation or shrubs or bogs. So the main thing about wetlands is it's where there is a predominance of water in the upper 12 inches of the profile, and it has to be for a sufficient period of time in the growing season to affect both the type of soil and the type of plants that are found there. So it's the influence of water on soil and plants. And wetland scientists identify wetlands based on those three criteria: soils, plants, and the presence of water for at least 2 weeks of the growing season.
When you say the growing season, what is a growing season? And is it different for different wetland types or different regions? How is a growing season defined?
Well, a growing season might be different in, say, in Eastern Washington in an arid area than here. But it's basically when the plants are actively growing, when the soil has warmed up enough that the plants are actively growing, and we usually identify it by bud break when plants start budding.
Oh, okay. And
so it could be February one year or March one year.
Okay. So it fluctuates kind of based on what the conditions are for the season of that particular year. But there are certain indicators that people look for to be like, okay, growing season has begun.
And skunk cabbage is one of our earliest indicators in many cases when we see the skunk cabbage flowering, or the osoberry Indian plum flowering.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that. I knew about the skunk cabbage, but not the osoberry. Yeah, I love seeing skunk cabbage because it was one of the first plants that I was able to identify to be like, oh, I'm in a wetland.
Yeah.
It's like, because they're big and they're they have a particular vibe about them.
Hmm. Hmm.
But okay, and you said the three indicators is that the presence of water for a duration, soil type, and plant type. I'm
Hmm.
wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what the characteristics. I mean, there's a duration of water, but like, what are the characteristics of each of those particular criteria that make something a wetland, or that you're looking for when you're evaluating a particular spot?
Okay, well, there's actually a national wetland plant list, but
Mhm.
and there the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has scientists who are dedicated to, uh, you know, compiling and maintaining that list of plants
Mhm.
across the country. It's based on plants that are what's called hydrophytic, that they love water.
Mhm.
And there are some plants that have a bigger range. They're more what we call facultative.
Hmm.
And there's other plants that are obligate. They have to be in an area where it's inundated or saturated to the surface, and they won't
Hmm.
grow in other areas, or at least like 99.9% of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Um, so we use that, and there's criteria and there's things that we determine, like, did it meet greater than 50% of these facultative or obligate plants.
Hmm.
Some are called fac wet because they like things wetter than others, so there's different things that we have. But like our salmonberry has a wider range, and
Hmm.
like uh, the cottonwood, the big black cottonwood, is something
Hmm.
that kind of has a, uh, uh, it can be in a wetter area, as well as alder. Alder can kind of be in wet areas or dry areas, but it's probably going to prefer it to be moisture, but we can
Hmm.
find it in areas that aren't. And then some trees are indicators of it not being a wetland. So like Western hemlock is not
Hmm.
going to grow. It doesn't like to have its feet wet, as we say. And But cedar won't grow where it's a complete saturation, although you can see it in bogs sometimes, and it
Hmm.
kind of grew up with it and adapted to that. But if you tried to plant it in a completely wet area, it might not take. Um, so, um, and my whole part of my whole reason for getting into soils was,
Hmm.
or getting into wetlands, was because I saw that I'd be digging in soils more if I branched into wetlands, because I really like digging in soils and looking at soils.
Hmm.
Wetland soils have special characteristics because it's caused by the lack of oxygen,
Hmm.
due to there being saturation or water. And the patterns of wetting and drying, like, so we can have wet during the growing season, but as the summer goes, it dries out. So in our kind of pseudo Mediterranean climate, many wetlands are seasonal,
Hmm.
um, seasonal wetlands, and they will dry out in the summer. So that allows the iron and manganese in the soil to kind of rust out of the soil solution, or the water that's in the soil. And then it creates like these patterns of color.
Oh.
So it's kind of like a rusty nail turning red. So you can see some pretty striking colors, and they're little flecks or blotches in the soil of reddish color. And also you will see what's called a reduced state. So when it's wet, it's going to be dissolved. And so it'll have a grayish tone to it. There are areas that never dry out, and they can have a really intense blue-green color, the iron and manganese being reduced, and by not being in contact with air. And those are quite amazing colors to see. And then also you get, because of lack of air, the bacteria can't eat up the organic matter. So you get these big accumulations of organic matter that in bogs and things like that. And that's why we have peat bogs and see that. So
when you're evaluating soil, is there a certain testing process, or can you do it by sight, or how do you really figure out what's in it and what classifies it?
Well, that's a whole, we dig soil pits and we have to describe them. I actually was on the soils judging team for UC Berkeley. I can't remember if I told you that before, but
that you were on the judging team? No, you told me that you participated in a competition. I knew about that.
Yeah. So you go and you describe the soil profile. So you have to describe the color, the texture, and you have to learn how to texture soil so that you can do it by feel. So if it's sandy or if it's, a silty clay and things like that, you have to describe that. And those will all have different characteristics. But the interesting thing is that anywhere around the world, if you have the same parent material or geologic base for the soil, and you have the same climate, elevation, or and it will create certain similarities in the plants that you find. And then the soils can be the same. So we have things called soil series where you can have that same soil series in Russia that we have here. And if you look at it, it might be looks slightly different, but pretty much they actually have a classification system for soils that is pretty remarkable, that it holds across, the globe because the environment is what dictates it.
So I think in terms of soil profiles here in Western Washington, do you know of any other regions in the world where we have similar soil types?
Let's see if I could think about that. Well, bogs, certainly. There's bogs all over the world. And, alpine soils are going to be similar. I would think that wetland soils, I can't say that I know specifically.
Yeah. I mean,
ones in other places, but
there's certain like characteristics, like you're saying, that like a bog here would have similar soil to a bog elsewhere in the world, just like.
Yeah. And like a volcanic soil, like we are a glaciated and volcanic. We have pretty young soils here.
Oh.
So we are very distinctly different from, say, Hawaii, who have very old, weathered soils. So it's very deep, like deep red. They're just extremely weathered and broken down, so that you don't have it's more clay, because it's broken down into the smaller fragments. So, but anywhere in the world where you have a newer volcanic, you're going to see similar soils and plants. And, if you think of the alpine here and the alpine, in Europe, it's probably going to be similar.
So you mentioned that here we have a lot of seasonal wetlands or wetlands that are dry for part of the year, and I'm wondering, and that you should be able to identify wetland soil even during a dry period because of the interaction,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's interesting because I do think that being in a place with a lot of seasonal wetlands, it does make it hard for the average person to identify a wetland, especially if they aren't aware that a wetland isn't always wet.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious. As our climate continues to change, do you have a sense of how that will impact wetlands in general in our region, seasonal wetlands in particular, and why it's important for us to protect wetlands as the climate continues to change?
Yeah. Well, wetlands basically act as sponges. They're storing water in the rainy season and they slowly release it in the dry season. So as the climate changes, they're going to play a critical role in storing water, preventing flooding, preventing fires, and keeping our wildlife healthy, because our wildlife need places, water and places to drink. And I can talk about this a little more later, but there's, wildlife depend on these wet areas quite a bit. Climate change isn't going to be predictable on the landscape necessarily. So in Western Washington, we are already seeing drier, hotter months in the summer. When I first moved here, we would have times where it rained every day in June and July, except for like 4 days. And now we're having these runs of 80, 90 degree weather for weeks. And that's really unusual. But then again, climate disruption, right? So we're going to have some big rains during the summer that we never had. And drier times in the winter with less snowpack, and then bigger rains in the spring. So wetlands are going to help store water, and they will help, when you have a big rainfall, to hold back the water from just creating this torrential stream flow or flooding, across properties. So it's good to have that. That's kind of nature's way of storing water. And for streams with fish, they're really essential for keeping a release of water to streams to keep the water cool in the summer. So,
which is very critical for salmon, right?
Pardon?
Sorry, it's like critical for salmon, right? Because salmon.
Yes, it's critical because they have to have a temperature of less than 65 degrees Fahrenheit in the water. And the water has to be deep enough in the summer to maintain that, and also to have a dissolved oxygen. It has to flow. If it's just sitting there stagnant, then it's not going to have enough oxygen for fish and other critters that the fish depend on as well. So for people, it's hard for people to identify that they have wetlands sometimes on their property. And that's why the county has maps, and there was a national wetlands inventory where people who have, training were able to look at aerial photographs, and they can kind of determine. You can see patterns of wetness, and there's really good tools with geographic information systems where they can determine where it's wetter. And so those, usually what the county does is they create a map so that you can see if you might have wetlands on your property, and that way to look at that more closely. And so you might find that the county will say, hey, if you put an application in to build something, they will say, well, you may have wetlands on your property, so you need to do that. And you may look and go, well, I don't see anything that looks like that because you don't see a swamp, So that's, but those areas are still really important. They're still providing that slow release of water to other areas.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know. Is it hard for aerial GIS? Is it difficult to identify forested wetlands? Because I imagine that if there's significant tree cover, like how would you be able to see that?
Yeah, well, I'm not like
You're not a
the
GIS
best
expert.
techie person on that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yes, it is harder, but they have a lot of tools, and now we have the ability to fly drones and do low elevation flying. So,
yeah,
but usually there will be an imprint where you can see what they do it in infrared and things like that, so they can see that there's a different moisture signature.
Oh, that's interesting.
To that piece, yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, there is a lot of tools that help us understand that.
So you mentioned that wetlands provide flood protection and water storage and also fire prevention. And I'm wondering if you could, and you said like wetlands are like a sponge, which makes sense. It's interesting to think about that, to be like wetlands are, an ecosystem onto themselves, and they have their own, inner workings, but they're also like a storage space for us. Mm-hmm. And it is interesting to think about that in terms of climate change, because like you mentioned, weather patterns are changing, and we might have more torrential rain than previous, times here in the Pacific Northwest. And it does make me think about flooding, and how if you have the storage space ready to receive water, it seems like it would logically reduce flooding. But I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little more.
Yeah, it's people have a tendency to want to drain water out of the landscape. That's what we've always done, is like ditch it, drain it, straighten streams so that they flow faster. But drying out our landscape when we're expecting a hotter, drier climate, or in climate where we have, torrential flooding, isn't going to be beneficial in the long run. It's kind of like, in some cities where they didn't, well, in Europe, you've heard of these horrible flooding things that they hadn't had previously. It's because they don't have the storm drain systems for them inside that city. And it's the same thing out on the landscape. If you kind of eliminate your storage area, then, and you've drained everything off, it is just going to flood when it's time to, when you have that situation. So it's better to we think of it as slowing down the water. So that's one of the reasons we don't want streams to be straightened, because they kind of, when you have a curvy stream, it's slowing down the water as it goes. So that will be creating, kind of ecological deserts when we do that, one thing. Beavers I just want to give a pitch for beavers, because they're great partners in helping store water, and people have a lot of consternation with beavers. But, there's a lot of people who are working on how we can kind of, living with beavers, how we can coexist with them, because they are the great architects to help us with this process. And we really should, in any development plan that we have that involves any streams and things like that, we should evaluate whether there's going to be beaver that are going to move in, and we should plan accordingly, rather than just go, okay, well, the stream's going to be this narrow, and in the end, it's probably not going to be that narrow when the beaver gets in there. And they create wetland areas, so.
Oh, that's really interesting. How do what is it that beavers do, like as a part of just their natural being that is helpful for wetlands and for the creation of wetlands? Like, what is it that they're doing? Is it beaver dams? I assume they do their fun little thing, but I don't know. I don't actually know much about beavers. So,
well, a great example is where I work. We had a stream restoration that was done, and they probably excavated the stream. It was a ditch. It was a great big ditch stream. And so then they put the curves back in it. We call it remeandering it.
Oh.
And they planned for like about a 10 to 15 foot width of the stream with the stream bank. Well, beavers move in at key places in those meanders. They kind of identify this is the best place to put my dam. And they basically widened the stream in these big ponds that it creates to about 90 feet, to over 90 feet in some cases, 75 feet.
Wow.
And so then they've raised the water table. And this is very important in the arid West, where they have no water on the landscape. Those landscapes have been grazed they have grazing all the way through the stream. And so no vegetation can ever grow there. With beavers moving in, it raises the water table, and then you get a riparian area, and it's, extremely beneficial for salmon. But it's also beneficial for the farm to have that extra water available.
Did the beavers move in because of the remeandering? Were they like what was, in terms of this like restoration project, what you said, it was like a ditch stream before?
Yeah.
And beavers weren't there, I assume.
Well, the reason beavers aren't there is because they were trapped out in the beginning of the century, and we've been having a resurgence of beavers now for, probably the last 20 years. They've been more prevalent. They've been coming back. They don't really have their predators are like cougars. So they have a good life strategy where they build their den out in the middle of the water, so things can't get to them. But but an area that has a bend in it, that little spot is going to be a key spot for them, because they know the water is slowing down there, and they can kind of trap the water there. But they also put dams in our ditches as well.
Oh, do they?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, they do. And this is happening everywhere, and people are frustrated about it because it can cause flooding. So there are tools that we can use, like exclusion devices, or we can put a leveler, a pond leveler, that is like a little pipe that goes through the middle of the dam to keep the water level at a given level so that it never exceeds that. And now they have developed ones that are fish passable.
Oh, cool.
Because if you're in a narrow ditch and the beaver dams it up, it makes it kind of impassable for fish. On the landscape, if the beaver moved in, and we've seen this where this restoration project is, they raise the water level up so much that another little channel forms, and it creates a more braiding. And so the fish have another way to get around. And this is how it's worked for thousands of years. Salmon developed with beaver on the landscape, and our area had a lot more water on it at that time. In fact, we've probably lost 75 to 85% of the wetlands nationally.
Yeah.
And a lot of it had to do with the beaver trade, plowing and ditching and things like that.
So there was like a combination of factors. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think about that because I know that, there are certain places, even just on the island here, that used to be wetlands. Like the building that Ween has its office in at the Bayview Cash Store used to be a wetland. People used to be able to
Mm-hmm.
bring their boat up to the cash store.
Uh-huh.
And, now we think of it as like completely dry land. Like, I don't think I don't know if it like from a soil perspective, if you were to like dig what you would find, but there really isn't any plant. There's nothing
Mm-hmm.
happening in that area anymore that indicates that it's still a wetland. And that makes me think about, something you said about, like wetlands being a sponge and, like when you drain a wetland, like that people have had this habit of wanting to pull the water out of a
Mm-hmm.
place or fill it. We had someone on the island
Yeah.
fill a wetland recently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that there's a certain point, like I'm wondering, like it sounds like there's a certain point in which a place that once had the capacity to hold water, the soil changes so that it doesn't have that capacity anymore, or that it runs off, right? Like, doesn't that happen at a certain point, like in terms of like the composition?
Well, no, not exactly. I mean, if you fill a wetland, that buried soil is under there. And in fact, when I worked for Snohomish County in the code enforcement department, we would find, we would get reports. So somebody's filling a wetland, we would go out and you could dig and you could find where it was, and you can identify very clearly where the wetland soil starts. But if you put enough fill on something, you that soil is not going to
Is not going to be able
necessarily,
to. Mhm.
because if you remember, it's the upper 12 inches of the soil that's
Oh
going to
yeah.
that
Okay.
it. And the reason it's 12 inches is because soil can transport water. It's a capillary
Mm.
action that pulls it up. If your water table's at 12 inches, it's probably going to be wet all the way to the soil surface, or at least within that 12 inches. And that's the main place that the roots are for the plants, that upper
Okay.
12 inches. So that's why it's so important for plants, you know, what the water regime is. But if you drain something, that does change. You will still be able to see that imprint of the wetland soil characteristic on that soil, but it might be more faded. There are ways that we can kind of identify that. But I can tell you that when I worked for Snohomish County, there were so many areas in the 80s that they just filled.
Mm-hmm.
And they basically filled streams. And I had people who had sump pumps in their basement because the developer just filled everything in, but that stream is still flowing subterranean because those are those channels alongside the stream is what we call the hyporeic zone. It still runs water. And so people had a lot of problems constantly with that. And the county would have to go in and actually pump out the drains in the street and stuff like that because it would get silted in from that. So it's not a good idea. And that's one of the things that the what's now the Natural Resource Conservation Service, used to be the Soil Conservation Service. They created these, with the soil map, like what are the areas that are buildable lands and what aren't buildable lands? Because if you have a bog, it's going to be really hard for you to create that into an area that it's buildable, and it's going to be very expensive. You're going to have to dig out all that organic matter. You can't build in stuff that's highly organic and things like that. So I'm curious now as to where your office is. I'll have to look at that.
Yeah. It's it's at Bayview Corner, and there are photos, like historical photos of it being surrounded by water.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. But it is interesting in terms of buildable lands. That's an interesting concept because, we're currently working on a mitigation analysis project. And a lot of the mitigation projects in Island County are on the shoreline and also in wetlands. Wetlands is one of the highest mitigation, seems like it requires the most mitigation based on the concept of reasonable use, that people have a right to build on their land if they own it, which is an interesting and tension-filled concept when you think about the ecological functioning, right, of an ecosystem or of a wetland, or of and it just seems like there's a lot of that people, do often build on wetlands in some regard. And so I'm curious what you think about that in terms of like our assessment of what reasonable use is and how we understand it.
Well, I haven't had too many projects that I, because I worked as a consultant. I did have one in Island County where they had a reasonable use, but they didn't build in the wetland, they built in the buffer. And so they had to reduce. I thought that Island County did a good job of making them reduce their footprint to the absolute minimum. But it creates some challenges because if you only have, a clearing limit of 10 feet around your house, it can create some issues for you with a tree that's right, within 10 feet of your house, and if it's in a wetter area, that might not be good. So it's going to create challenges. It's interesting because what's been proposed, but this hasn't been followed through with, but on the Tulalip tribes, because they have a limited land base and the tribes owns their own land. A lot of tribal members were allotted, areas that are wetland because that was how the U.S. government divided it up.
Yeah.
And so they're thinking about a land swap. And I don't know to what extent that could happen, but that's something that seems like it would be a good thing for counties to do. Like if somebody, they inherited this property from their grandfather and they always thought, oh, this is someplace that I had, as my little nest egg and I could build on this someday, or I could give it to my kids and they would be able to build on it someday, and then find out that it's, 75% wetlands, that's hard. And we do have a private property system in our world. The tribes is a little bit different. They own their land collectively, and then people have their individual allotments too. But the counties could, try to address that, buying land that they could do as a land swap and things like that. If we had enough money for them to do something like that for people, rather than just say, okay, you can build on it. But it's a lot of these properties. I don't know. I don't know of cases where they have let them build in a wetland. I think for the most part, they've said you can do the very smallest thing. You could put a little recreational trailer on there or something like that. And that's, that's a hard pill for people to swallow. So I understand that. Yeah. It's one of those conundrums we have to figure out a better system for ourselves.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting to think about, private property land ownership and the evolving understanding of our ecological systems, because as far as I understand, wetlands used to be considered, quote, wastelands prior to, I don't know, was it like the 1970s was when things changed for wetlands, or do you have a sense of that timeline in terms of development?
Oh, well, 1972 was the Clean Water Act. And then, but like in Washington State, we didn't really have any wetland regulations until 1990.
Right. So it's relatively
1994 or
recent,
something.
right? Like our idea that they're protected, ecosystem class is super recent. Because I think I live in a fourplex that is absolutely in a wetland buffer. Like my backyard is a wetland, and I love it because I love the wetland. But like every time I walk out of my house, I'm like, I do not believe that they would have been able to build this property.
Oh, they wouldn't nowadays.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in the 80s, I think, even though the Clean Water Act got passed, I was going to get into this, basically we have now what's called a no net loss policy. But that didn't really start until like Jimmy Carter passed it as an executive order in 1977, but it didn't become national policy. And then Nixon followed him, but they passed the Clean Water Act during that. Oh, wait a minute. Backwards. But anyway, in 1987 is where we started having a policy, and it was adopted it was proposed in 1987, and George Bush adopted it in 1989. So that policy, it was a compromise between development and conservation, but it did look at the need to protect wetlands and that we had to create wetlands and restore wetlands. So where you have an impact wetland, you need to replace it so that we have no net loss of wetlands, and also increase wetland conservation and restoration, because we'd already lost, like 75% of our wetlands at that point nationally. So there became, I think with the passing of the Clean Water Act, there was just a lot more awareness that we were losing these things. So basically no net loss is wetland protection, creation of new wetlands, restoration, enhancement, management, and even education, research, and information.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, you've worked in wetland restoration, right? Like as a part of
mitigation a lot too.
Mitigation. So both. Well, I should think that was one of my questions, is if you could explain to people the difference and the intention behind a wetland restoration versus wetland mitigation.
Yeah. So every administration since that kind of no net loss, I think they've annually allocated monies for wetland restoration to fill that gap, because we lost so many. And but with the Clean Water Act, where impacts are required to be mitigated, wetlands need to be created, and those monies come from whoever the developer is, or the person who is creating the impact. So there are monies nationally for restoration, but we cannot spend restoration monies to mitigate for somebody's individual personal impact to wetlands. So like the county, if they have to, when they're building a road or they're widening a road or doing something like that, or installing a utility, they're going to have to mitigate if they impact wetlands, but they can't use restoration dollars that they've received to, for a wetland restoration proposal, to spend on that. So those monies are kept separate.
Mm-hmm.
So one is we're restoring what we already lost. We're restoring to replace what we already lost. And like in Washington State, we lost a lot of what's called estuarine wetlands, areas where at the river mouths where they're just really productive areas and extremely important for salmon rearing, because the salmon move out of the river. They need a place that's kind of between freshwater and saltwater to kind of have their bodies adjust before they go out to the open ocean. So these estuarine wetlands, we lost a whole bunch of those because they got put behind dikes and then plowed, and they got drained and plowed and farmed. And so there's actually big kind of historical reconstructions where they figured out where this happened. And, we see the loss of the salmon populations in those systems. And so most of these restoration projects, like here on Camino, we had the ID farm restoration that has created, an incredible area for both birds on the Pacific Flyway and also for salmon coming in there, and they're tracking that. So that's what restoration is for, is to kind of restore some of those losses that we had by our past practices or kind of ignorance of what we were doing on the landscape. And then mitigation is just where if you're going to impact a wetland, then you need to replace that. And the thing about mitigation is that they have found that there have been studies that show that you can't just dig a hole in the ground and say, okay, this is going to be a wetland now. It's hard to make a wetland again. And so, there was a lot of monies being put into mitigation that actually were not proving to be doing what they said they were going to do. They aren't contributing to that no net loss. So there's a lot more stringent regulations now. In 2008, they came out with a new mitigation rule about that. And now I was just in a webinar yesterday about the new administration's ruling about what is a water of the U.S., because wetlands have been waters of the U.S., and they are going to really reduce what is considered a water of the U.S., and a lot of the responsibility for that is going to be put on states. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be somewhat of a nightmare for anybody who wants to develop. They're going to have this whole, this piece of this one big wetland. There's this piece that's federal, and that the rest of it is state, regulatory, and they're going to have a nightmare of having to navigate that.
Here in Washington, it's the Department of Ecology that regulates our wetlands, right? At the state level?
They have the authority. The authority is passed down to them for the Clean Water Act. Yes. All the Clean Water Act. So that's why they have the wetland regulations, and, like the counties are required to have their own, or cities are required to have their own. But Department of Ecology provides the framework and this, the studies that help with doing that.
So you mentioned a little bit about habitat. You gave your shout out to the beaver, and you've mentioned some of the ways in which wetlands provide habitat for salmon. I'm wondering, what other kinds of animals and what other kind of habitat wetlands provide?
Well, like I said, there's all kinds of wetlands on the landscape, but
yeah, there's so many. Actually, how many types of wetlands are there? Do you know?
Well, I don't know if I could enumerate them. There's a whole classification system.
Yeah.
That is called coward.
It's called coward.
Like there's from forested and different kinds of forested wetlands to scrub shrub to kind of more what we call herbaceous or grassy. There's estuarine, which is what those wetlands that are kind of at the mouth of the river, and they're blocked off from the salt water somewhat, but they have salty characteristics. And so those are broken down. There's all kinds of different vegetation regimes and stuff. So
it's pretty complicated. It's yeah.
But greater than 75% of wildlife species and critters use wetlands in some part of their life cycle. So they're really critical in food webs and basically the web of life. Everything needs water. And there are many species who depend on wetlands for breeding and raising young. But I think of it a lot in our island environment that there is a greater limitation. We don't have that many streams flowing through our islands, at least on Camino. So, where there is water is really key. And animals have to travel to get to that water. And, they don't drink the salt water we're surrounded by water, but it's salt water. So they have to get that. So they cross roads, and that creates an impact. So that's another reason to think about, if you have a little wetland on your property, that's a really precious thing for wildlife and other critters. So in terms of different types of wetlands, I mean, I've walked through forested bogs where there's giant trees, but you can feel it spongy under your feet as you're walking, or there's open fens and bogs where it's basically a sponge of it's basically a bunch of organic matter that's floating on water and vegetation, even trees. We have a tree, Western white pine, that is adapted to living in those conditions, and a couple other kinds too. Those are really critical areas for indigenous our indigenous populations. Those were really important food and medicine sources for them. But all those areas have specific insects, amphibians, birds, and wildlife that are adapted to that, whatever that set of things. And wetlands are really key in Washington State and elsewhere. They were really important foods and medicines for the indigenous tribes.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, I think wetlands are fascinating because they're so diverse. And as you said, they interact with and touch everything. We don't think about it, but they're really, very critical to the cycle of life, which includes actually, human populations and our relationship.
Yes.
And so, you mentioned
part of it.
What'd you say?
We are part of it.
Yeah, we're a part of it, even in places like urban areas where you wouldn't think we're a part of it. And so I'm curious if you could, explain why wetland protection is critical for urban areas
Okay. Yeah. Well, urban areas have issues that are created by a lack of forest cover, for one thing. And those are going to get more intense with climate change. We call them heat sinks. And so protecting wetland areas within urban areas, including a sufficient buffer, it helps maintain those food webs. We don't want to create ecological deserts on the landscape where it's hard for, say, low migratory species to access. We don't want to completely crash our insect populations, for instance. But it also keeps things cooler, and it is really important for absorbing and storing and cleaning stormwater. So any wetland that you have in an urban area, actually you probably have to have some protections for that wetland for its water quality. Even though wetlands can clean the water, we don't want to too dramatically change their chemical balance. But managing stormwater in urban areas is critical. And we've come to realize we can't really pave over every inch of the landscape. We have to leave room for water. For green, we call it green infrastructure, where that wetlands can be a critical part of. So we can have cleaner air, less flooding, and maintain food webs, such as for pollinators. Having those areas, it just makes it a nicer place to live, for one thing. It's having those areas of green is really important for people.
Yeah, important for people, important for the food web, important for habitat, and also important, as you said, for helping to manage climate change. The changes that come with climate change.
As things get hotter, that's why a lot of cities have a tree planting program. Seattle, I think, has one where they're trying to plant 1 million trees. Yeah.
As we're having this conversation about, green infrastructure, and we're currently in the planning period for the Island County Comprehensive Plan, I'm wondering if you, as a wetland ecologist, have any ideas about how, as a community and as a jurisdiction, we could better protect wetlands over the next 20 years.
Well, I thought that this particular comprehensive plan update is mainly addressing housing kind of things, but Island County kind of created its own critical area ordinance. It sort of completely sidestepped the Washington Department of Ecology recommendations and said, we're going to do our own thing. We're not going to do what you recommend. And without getting overly technical, many of the buffers for wetlands in Island County are way too low. For example, coastal lagoons, which are one of those kind of estuarine kind of areas, they're critical habitat, but they only have a 100-foot buffer or less. And that's less than what we call a site potential tree height. So if you think of a tree height, you can fit one tree, or maybe if trees have probably a full-grown tree might have a 25-foot spacing between them.
Okay.
I think that's 4 trees. Those lagoons are really important habitats, and in order to protect their water quality and have many of these things, when you see a stream, the stream doesn't really function without trees on the side of it. The trees is where all the bugs are that drop into the stream that then feed the fish and feed everything else. And so, if the adjacent land use was low intensity, you could have what they call low intensity. You could have that 100-foot buffer or less. But you could have a grazed field right up to that buffer. Agricultural uses are pretty much exempt from these requirements. So they could be spreading manure on that field and right up to the...
Yeah.
And so think about a bog. A bog has extremely narrow chemical characteristics to it. And it's probably the most delicate and irreplaceable wetland habitat we have. And so those only have a buffer of 125 feet. If you were going to build a residence on your property. So you could essentially put your house like within 125 feet of that bog, as long as you didn't clear more than 30% of your property or something like that. That's inadequate. And they have language in there. Well, you shouldn't use pesticides. You shouldn't use, lawn chemicals. But once that permit's issued and the house is there, we're not going to be,
right. You're not going to, there isn't actually going to be monitoring of it. Yeah.
Yeah. We're not going to be monitoring what every landowner's doing. And people would, be up in arms if we did that anyway. So, less than one tree height or maybe a width of 4 trees is so inadequate for a bog. I mean, in most places where they consider it a high intensity, it's going to be much bigger. But those kind of things, they tried to just limit the buffers as much as they could.
So you would increase how much would you increase the buffers for these areas? Like what would be the ideal buffer?
Well, I think a bog needs at least 200 to 300 feet. It's a very special environment. And it's like the same as a mature forested wetland. You don't, because the problem is when you cut trees to the edge of something, then you're going to have tree fall because there's going to be there's going to be blow down. And so it's going to impact that buffer on the edge. So you want to have enough that it really protects it. And then for a mature conifer forest, you want to have something that the species that utilize these mature conifer forests, you don't want cowbirds coming in there and nesting in the species that, they'll parasitize the nests of, warblers and things like that utilize those areas. So it's not really based on best available science. They did their own, quote, best available science, but it really didn't, I think there's been a lot of updates since then. Those are just a couple of examples.
Those are just a couple of examples. I mean, what else do you?
We could get into a lot of technical stuff, but for another is a wetland associated with a fish-bearing stream. Think of an adjacent wetland along the stream edge. It is an area that's, the water's kind of seeping out and it's created a little wetland. That's a pretty unique little habitat. If that area is less than 1,000 square feet, it's completely exempt under this ordinance. So they have things like that. And where if it's under 1,000 feet, it's just exempt. And the thing is, a lot of these small wetlands actually they have found are very key for amphibians. They need a little, if you have a little area in your woods that has a little ponded area, it can be extremely shallow, but that's going to be critical for amphibians to live. And so you just reduce the stream buffer basically to that stream by ignoring that wetland like it's not part of the stream. Basically little 1,000 square foot.
Right.
If it's not contiguous to the rest of the, there's a little piece here, and then further upstream, there's another little piece and things like that. They're just ignoring those.
Well, I think that's helpful. I think this is really important to talk about these things, regardless of how technical they are, because best available science is what's required by law. And it is true that in between updates, science changes, right? So like Island County now has an opportunity in the comprehensive plan to vision set through the natural resources element. And then I think next year is when the critical areas ordinance is coming up for review.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Yeah. So we will have an opportunity, you and I and the rest of our community, to like actually weigh in, I think, on the critical areas ordinance in particular. But I do think that this is a great conversation to have, because one of the elements that we will be wanting to give robust feedback on is the natural resources element, and how it talks about natural resources, and, and how it talks about critical areas,
Okay.
And that's the, but the critical areas ordinance update, it'll be great to be able to talk about increasing wetland buffers and really getting into what is the best available science now, and how can Island County update to be in compliance with that.
I just wanted to say there was one other thing which I hope the county could address, and where they need better protection is the area of forested wetlands.
Okay.
It has to do with the fact that Island County does not really have any commercial forest lands, but all the permits go to the Department of Natural Resource as forestry permits. There is what is called a Class 4 permit, which is when you're planning on converting your land. But the majority of people will apply for a Class 3 permit. They go to the Department of Natural Resources, because those commercial forest lands are considered like those are going to stay in forest. You're going to reforest those. That's a requirement.
Yeah.
And so you don't need to protect the buffer as much. You can, I think they do, but they under that thinking are allow for forested wetlands, for example, to be harvested.
Yes.
And so these people apply, do their forestry not in compliance with county code, then plan just to wait out 6 years of a forest practice moratorium to sell it or develop it. And then they've lost all the buffers, and the way the code is written, if you already have a buffer that's eliminated, you don't have to replant that,
I'm really glad you brought this up. We did an episode on this called
Good.
Island County Practices, because Marion, this is one of the things that Marion is very frustrated by also.
Yeah.
And because there are no timberlands of long-term commercial significance in Island County, and yet people are applying for forestry permits under the Department of Natural Resources, except like when you said, it's a Class 4, which is a conversion permit, which means that your intention is to build when you apply for the permit. But sans that, you're right. Like you can log a wetland under a forestry permit. And I know that this happened on Camino Island, and that people, it's happened also on Whidbey Island too. But I think somewhat recently there was a forestry permit where a wetland was logged, and it was perfectly acceptable under the current code.
Yeah. And those are extremely unique habitats where when it's a wetland that's developed into a forested stand is, that's taken a lot of years to develop that habitat. So it's going to take a long time for it to come back. And it's, losing the trees. The trees do absorb water. So trees are our friends in terms of, if you're worried about flooding on your property, trees are good in that regard too. So anyway, I think that's one of the biggest impacts to wetlands that we're seeing in the county. right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. And as you said, it's very hard to restore a wetland once it's been destroyed. It takes an incredible amount of effort. And I do think, if in terms of addressing this issue, what would you recommend the county do to better protect forested wetlands? Like, what would be the code change you would make? What would be the permitting change that you would think we could
if they were to adopt something, Mariana Dane knows a lot more about this than me, but if they were to adopt something where they recognize that these are areas of high risk of conversion, the they could just tighten things up so that people basically, if you're going to log an area, especially, if it's like a 2 or 3 acre area and it's got a wetland on it,
seems pretty clear
you
that
aren't going to maintain that in a forest once you've cleared it. Land is too valuable here. And so the county needs to recognize that and just say, no, everything that you do, like in Snohomish County, I believe if you are inside a city and you can't apply for a class 3 permit. You have to apply as class 4 permit, and you have to put the buffers on that are required by the county. That's what I remember from when I worked there. So they could do something like that, where anywhere on the island, unless you have some kind of long-term forest management plan or something for a big, huge tract, but we just don't have that many of those.
No, because we have no long-term, we have no lands of long-term commercial, timberlands of long-term commercial significance.
Yeah. So any of them can be developed. That's what it comes down to. And so we're just saying, okay, we trust you. You're not going to develop this. They just need to address that by requiring class 4 permits for anything in Island County.
I think you're right. I think the class 4, if you're going to log in a critical area, right? Like it's one of those things where, people who have forestry practices and sustainable forestry practices probably aren't logging in wetlands.
Yeah.
And if you are looking to do that, you should have to apply for a class 4 permit and put in buffers. And the other thing I remember from the conversation I had with Marion and Steve is that if someone truly is in forestry and plans on remaining in forestry and wants to log a wetland, that the moratorium should be increased to 12 years, 20 years. If it really is, if you really don't have the intention of developing, and there is no conversion potential, then increasing the moratorium should be fine. Yeah. But I think the other thing about that is problematic about the permitting process is that the moratorium starts at the time of the filing of the permit, not the logging. And so people can wait out a permit period, log, and then, sell it for conversion, which I think also happens. Yeah. Yeah. So that is, I think, one of the biggest areas of reform, I think that we could focus on. Thanks for bringing it up. But are there some places like wetlands that are your favorite? Do you have any favorite type of wetland, favorite, place in Island County or in the region you like to go?
Well, I'm not as familiar with all the places on Whidbey, I will have to say, but some of my favorite wetland spots are Barnum Point. County Park is got all these beaver ponds that, have created a wetland area in them. And it's just really cool because there's always lots of wildlife and birds there. So it's neat, and it's just really peaceful to go there. And then Cranberry Lake is kind of similar on Camano Island at the state park there. That's one of my favorite hikes. So cool. I always see interesting things there. And it's because a lot of things utilize those areas, So
Yeah. I mean,
nice.
we walked up Barnum Point together, and it was the first time I had been there. And I thought it was such a cool place to visit. I think,
Yeah.
anyone who hasn't been there, go visit on Camino Island.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to see how the vegetation was different from Whidbey, that the way things grow and what grows out there in a wetland area is like similar but different somehow. Like the pond lilies were different.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we have a lot of, estuarine areas. I really love the EB's Landing area, and that lagoon there.
That lagoon is super cool. Yeah. I love that lagoon.
Kind of things.
Yeah. Cool. Was there anything else you want to share with people about wetlands before we close out?
I think we covered things pretty well. I can't think of anything else.
No? Great. Well,
time.
We did it. I hope that people, after listening to this, understand a little bit more about what a wetland is, why, why we should care about wetlands, how we can protect wetlands in Island County. I think that, we have a really great opportunity upcoming, both with this Island County comprehensive plan and also the update to the critical areas ordinance to do more for wetlands. And I think that, as we talked about in our conversation, understanding the importance of wetlands and then having regulations to protect them is relatively new. And so I think that we're at a point in updating regulations and codes where we can do a really good job of it because we have the science to support it. So I'm hoping that that's the outcome, that, we can all have a better understanding of this ecosystem and then protect it better.
Yeah. I always am surprised by people that, even people who care about the environment, they're really perplexed about wetlands and don't, it's kind of it's something that is hard to grasp, I guess.
Well, they're complex and they're various and they're mysterious and they're really important. So thank you so much for talking with us about them and we'll talk again soon.
Okay. Thank you.
Another man up in the pulpit in the state house. Head of the table with a black pen, scratching egos, talking too loud. Externalize every outcome, every home gun, every profit. And kneeling down to the flashing numbers, the NASDAQ, the cold constructs. Running backwards, so just keep moving, just keep moving, just keep moving. Unlearning every lesson that our mothers tried to teach us.
This podcast is a production of the Whidbey Environmental Action Network and is made possible by our generous donors. Produced, edited, and mixed by me, Amanda Bullis. Special thanks to Marianne and Steve for their years of service through action and for lending their voices to this podcast. To WEEN's Executive Director, Marnie Jackson, and our board for their leadership. Special thanks to Whidbey musician Nathaniel Talbot for letting us use his track Intuition from the album Animal, available on Bandcamp.
There's a war being waged back at the workplace. Every day on your paycheck, a volume of confidence against the idea of your body being put into your own hands. So please don't hold it, please don't hold it, please don't hold it back. Unleash the power, the straight logic of compassion. What I need now ain't that old religion or the cold hard facts. Just need a woman in which get us on track. Just need a woman in which get us on track. out of the shadow of a false man's allegory, slowly erasing that old violence from the story. Recoupling emotion, slow emotion to intelligence, granting the planters, healers, teachers, feelers a new relevance. What I need now ain't that old religion or the code